Hello and welcome to Chain Reaction. I'm Frankie Boyle and my guest today is a comic book writer that will be recognised by every geek, nerd and potential high school shooter around the world. He's written Superman, Batman, The Invisibles, reimagining whole comic book universes like some fickle and insane Dunoon-based god. Please welcome Thought Engine and Knight of Chaos, Grant Morrison. So when did comics start? How did you get into comics?
Because when I was a kid, I was totally always into comics, and they seemed like a really great vehicle for expression. So I had these like characters like Captain Clyde when I was like 17.
And that was in a local paper?
Yeah, it was a local paper that ran in 3 papers, and he was an unemployed Glasgow superhero. Right? But the guy, he lived in a flat in Hill Head, right? He had the powers of Superman, but he's complete underachiever. You know, he would just hang about Hill Head and he would solve like minor scale problems in the underground and stuff like that. And he used to shop in local stores, and like my dentist was in it. You know, it was the most pathetic lo-fi superhero in the world. And I'd had these characters like the Blue Phantom, who sounds like a sex pest. It's like the Triple X Ghost, and the Chimpians, who are a bunch of chimpanzee superheroes. So I'd always created comics, so they came first, and then I got into music because I realised I'd been sitting in my bedroom for 10 years with no female contact.
Writing about chimpanzees?
No, I was told my head was filled with like copulating chimpanzees. And I thought maybe it's time to get out, so I started up in a band, and we got out, and it took like 3 years for any human beings even to notice us.
And how did people react to Captain Clyde when it was like printed beside the junior football results? Or
well, they seemed, because it was a local newspaper, and their idea, like a big major story in the week, was like Mrs. MacGyver's cat has been startled by a starling. You know? So it was like, that was a big deal in the paper. Then inside I had Captain Clyde fighting these like skull-faced horrors and baby-eating demons. There's too many bloody bones and like flaming heads.
Cool. Sounds pretty good.
Right next to the TV schedules. So there was like old women would read this and like long-term unemployed and get like seriously traumatised. So they eventually kicked me off it. And they replaced me with Tom and Jerry. Like that's, like Tom and Jerry's the most violent thing in the universe.
There's a whole thing in, people talk about the ultimate thing in graphic novels or comics is to transcend the genre and just get away from, being a comic book. Whereas your thing, I read your book Super Gods, it seems to be more that your thing is that you're part of the continuity. You're one of the people that writes Superman, one of the people that works on Batman, and there'll be people before you and after you. And
yeah. I mean, obviously I make my own characters. That's a totally different type of storytelling. But say you're writing Superman. Superman's been around since 1938. Generations of people have added to this guy's adventures. When he first appeared, he was a kind of communist, socialist champion of the people. Then a few years later the war starts and the guy's like riding missiles into Japanese warboats, and he's like, sitting there like this huge phallic thing extending from Superman's crotch aimed at the Japanese war machine. In the 50s suddenly he's back home and he's got a super cat and a super dog and super friends and people that visit him from the future, and it's like a 50s soldier home from the war. So he's constantly always represented what people are into at any given time. I found it fascinating going into that world where Superman's been real since 1938. He's been around much longer than me or you or anybody in here, and he'll be around when we're all dead and there's other people in a room just like this listening to people just like us. So there's a kind of weirdness of going into those environments where they have these characters that have persisted for decades, and suddenly you get a chance to make Superman speak.
I always thought it was unlucky for Superman that he landed on another dying planet. I think
but it served him right, because ultimately everything about the planet Krypton was wrong. It would be Jor-El would say to him, the whole planet's shaking, it's falling apart. You've seen these movies, right, and the planet's shaking, and Jor-El says to him, I'm a bit worried, but there's some trauma in the core of this planet. I think it's about to fall apart. Oh no, Jor-El, you're an idiot. And within 2 days the entire planet falls apart.
Well, maybe maybe the planet was fine and Jor-El was just really depressed.
Yeah, I mean, that stuff happens all the time, isn't it? It's like people projecting their own fears of mortality onto the cosmos. Probably the planet's still there and Superman gets sent to Earth and everybody else is still back there having a party.
You wrote a book, Super Gods, which is sort of about that. It starts with the continuity of the superheroes, and you only pop up sort of halfway through. So it's kind of like an autobiography, but you only pop up when you kind of get born into the continuity.
They asked me to do some autobiographical elements to that book, so I kind of just put in the bits where I was most connected with comics. I treated myself as part of the story of comic books, and suddenly this creature pops in 1960 along with the Flash and tries to run alongside that guy.
I started to get into comics in the 90s, and there seemed to be this idea about then, like an increase in realism. So it was things like, Batman suddenly was busting his knee and having to take a week off and all that kind of thing. Did you enjoy that, or were you sort of rebelling against that?
No, I just thought it was daft, because Batman could never be real. It's just stupid.
I thought, like, everybody's up in the rooftops in Gotham. You think, in reality, Gotham PD could have just controlled the whole thing really pretty easily. Everybody's just cutting about on a rooftop in plain view of a sniper.
No, obviously they're all wearing faces, the Joker's got this. You can see him from 3 miles away. You just shoot him from a blimp.
Also, increasing security on Arkham Asylum might have been an idea.
No, but they don't. In Gotham City, like the madmen to be able to run free and just letting the chaos element and see what happens.
Maybe locating Arkham Asylum outside of Gotham might have been a start, rather than just, that guy's got out again, he's killed 400 people.
No, I mean, given the recidivism of Arkham Asylum, they should have located it in space.
Well, there's no way some of those people are going to reform, though, because like, some of them are like giant crocodiles and stuff.
How can you expect him to... You can't even explain the meaning of reforming to a giant crocodile, man.
I used to be a giant crocodile, but now I'm selling telephone systems. Grrr. There's been this idea, like, comic book conceits, the big ones, and they just don't have enough strength to them innately to sustain much. So the idea that Batman was designed to be a wee comic strip, it wasn't designed to hold big ideas. What do you think of that?
Well, except that it's he's one of the most popular pop culture characters in the world, and obviously appeals on a number of levels over decades. So I think Batman can carry all kinds of weight. So I've used him in stories that deal with existential fear, or I've used Superman to deal with the death of my father, or the upcoming Wonder Woman's about feminism and mother-daughter relationships. So I used to have, if I was depressed, I would make the Justice League fight it, and I'd write 3 issues where the Justice League are fighting Mageddon, which is some monster from beyond space and time, that was just represented how I happened to be feeling at the time when I was listening to Blue Jam. I honestly believe these things can easily carry all kinds of weight, because all they are is symbols. It's like Batman's just a symbol of our indomitable will to fight the darkness inside ourselves. Superman's a kind of sun god version of the best inside us. So they can do all kinds of stuff. I think it's ridiculous to imagine that there's any limits to these things.
Is it weird that you wake up in Dunoon most days and have to decide what happens in Gotham and Metropolis?
I think it'd be weird for them to wake up. But for now, I can live outside Dunoon, so I can watch it from a distance. But Dunoon on a Friday night is actually more dangerous than Gotham. And the real truth is, like, Batman would last like 5 minutes on the high street. Had no chance. You'd go out there on a Friday night and just, let's clean up crime. Lying on the floor covered in blood. They don't even have an A&E department, so you'd lie there for 5 hours and then be found dead in the morning.
I had this idea that, like, murderers don't leave witnesses, so the Batman story is really just the revenge fantasy of a boy dying in an alley.
Yeah.
But it was just way too depressing to ever do anything with.
I mean, it could be. We could watch that over 400 pages as the blood slowly leaking out of this young boy's body as he imagines himself living the life of Batman. But I think it would break the heart of every child in the world.
Great, that's what I want to do.
Somebody's got it. Santa Claus has tried.
I'm going to release it, man, be the Grinch who stole Ramadan or something. You did a book called Invisibles. It meant a lot to me, actually, because at the time that came out, that was just like a big download of information for me of like all these things I'd never heard of. Terence McKenna, Robert Anton Wilson, loads of stuff that I came to really enjoy. I was introduced to through that, and it's a really hopeful, almost like a transcendent comic about where is reality going. And then you follow that up with a book I really love called The Filth, which is a really depressing, negative, grim comic. What was going on in your head at the time?
Well, I'd had these 8 years where I decided to turn myself into this kind of cosmic seeker, and I basically took off around the world and shaved my head and travelled, and I decided to write this comic, The Invisibles, which was about this kind of hedonistic 90s, the Berlin Wall had just come down, everything felt as, it's the end of history, it's going to be brilliant, we can just go anywhere we want. But at the end of that, I started to feel, I'd spent 8 years trying to break down my personality. Like Rambo had that whole thing about the systematic derangement of the senses. So I spent my first Batman royalties on exactly that, the systematic derangement of the senses. So I'd wind up in Bali on magic mushrooms. And then I came home and it was like late 90s Britain, and it was like the ecstasy come down. So suddenly it seemed like the world had changed, and it was pre 9/11, but I think we all knew everything was going to go wrong. There was a certain darkness. So I wanted to deal with that in the filth. And The Invisibles was about cool counterculture rebels, like saving the world from evil totalitarian powers. Then I thought, what would it be like to be one of those totalitarian powers? And that's what The Filth was about. Like, what happens if you're just a seemingly ordinary person who's recruited into an organisation who are basically the bin men of the universe, and they take away all the crap, and you're the head guy of that. So it was about that, and I kept listening to that. From 2001: A Space Odyssey, where HAL 9000 is dying, which is, I'm losing my mind, Dave. I would just listen to this in hysterics. And it was my favourite thing at the time, just listening to this, basically consciousness at the last gasp, and I would kind of lie in bed, just and that was my life at the time. So
they did some experiments where you add a rat to a certain ideal population of rats, that they'll all just go mad and start eating each other, and you did that in the Filth with they drop one more person onto a ship and it just descends into sort of cannibalism and grafting tits.
It could happen here tonight. But yeah, it was that was a real thing. They were going to build this thing called the Freedom Ship, which would traverse international waters, and super rich people would live on it. And I thought, wouldn't it be weird if the population just kept growing and growing, and eventually they put just one person on it and it all goes to hell? But they did these experiments in the 50s. This guy called John B. Cahoon put a bunch of rats in a pit, and they fed them, they gave them everything they wanted, and the rats, just kept breeding, and the population got bigger and bigger and bigger, and then it starts to get really weird because the resources run out and the rats start cannibalising each other, and like, the weird thing is these strange rats start to appear in the midst of this that they call the beautiful ones. So the beautiful ones appear, and what they do is they just sit on their own, and while the rest of society is collapsing, they groom themselves and they make themselves look really pretty. I thought, you can kind of see that happening right now. Talisa, I think, would be an example of one of these.
I don't know if she's ever been called one of the beautiful ones, to be honest.
No, I think I'm being kind tonight. So.
Is that what the internet seems like to you now? Is it like a kind of homogenising thing of just for people to get distracted by, or is it something that could be interesting?
Well, it's both. The trouble is everything's multidimensional, so to decide one thing's one way and it's not the other way, it would be to make a mistake. But the internet's cool because it is homogenising people. It's really weird. There used to be there'd be a single nutcase in your town. There'd be some little guy who dressed in black, or some weird girl who wrote Sylvia Plath style poetry. But now all these people can connect up. So what they're doing is they smooth one another out across the globe. And they stop being as weird as they might have been when they used to be allowed to grow in the darkness like mushrooms behind the radiator. They're not quite as weird as they were once, but at the same time they're all linking up.
Yeah.
And they've invented this radio telepathy thing, right? They've got rats now. A rat can think of being hungry in Hong Kong, and suddenly a rat in London wants to eat because they're connected up. That's the next generation of the phone. We got Skynet is coming, but Skynet, it's not like Terminator where it wants to create robots to kill us. All it wants to get off with us. It's obsessed with us. The phone wants to have sex with us, and you're watching it getting closer and closer, and it's getting deeper and deeper, and then the next generation of kids will have it implanted in their heads and be able to send emails just by blinking, and that's going to be really weird. I'm looking forward to that.
I totally feel that is where it's heading. I don't know if anyone's been on those things that are like internet chatbots, which are like artificial intelligences. You can communicate with them, they're just online. So the first one I heard of was on a BBC item about how great this is. They've now developed these intelligences you can talk to, and you go on and talk to it, and all it talks to you is sex.
Yeah.
I mean, it just sexually threatens you, basically, at length. And you sort of think, well, this is something we hadn't imagined. Now, my idea is, if you got people who are good at pretending to be humans, if you got psychopaths to design chatbots, they could start to pass as human. And perhaps eventually, if they became intelligent enough, this is the sort of world that a psychopathic computer would have designed. And that, like, love exists as a memory. That's why we can't really feel love anymore, because it's a memory that the psychopaths had of something that they didn't have but knew that they were supposed to feign.
Happy Christmas to all of you.
Well, there's that thing, isn't there, of like just different cultures are kind of turned on by each other. So we have this whole thing of like they had police agents going into groups like environmental activists and having relationships with people, but they're kind of turned on by the whole idea of
course,
revolution.
Like, police and rebels are turned on by each other. That's why they're constantly meeting in clashes.
Kettling is the next stage.
They're absolutely drawn to one another. You know, I always think you should keep away from these weird situations where complete ideological opposites are very bizarrely attracted to each other, you know.
Riots are never that far off an orgy, are they? You sort of get a feeling if you...
Well, they are. It's a coming together of two complete opposite ideologies to meet in this like orgasmic, ecstatic exchange of blows.
Maybe one day they'll just like smash the water cannon through the window of Lush and it'll all kind of foam up.
And then a tank of flowers will blow up and will rain down and everybody will suddenly be high and they'll all start kissing and then we'll be fine. Because synthesis will emerge from thesis and antithesis. I want to see the cops just kissing all those like V for Vendetta masks and and the smile just gets bigger.
A casual reader of something like The Invisibles might think that you were quite into conspiracy theories and UFO sightings and all that kind of stuff, but you're not really.
No, I think it's all bollocks, honestly. But I'm fascinated. I think it's a secular alternative to religion. You know, like people come up with this idea that somebody somewhere is in charge. No, nobody's in charge. You know, the people who rule this world, they're like a few decades old. They're idiots. They're doing their best to like try and look sexy and cool in front of the rest of us, but really they're just like ordinary. Just think of what you'd be like trying to run Russia. Yeah. You know? And so yeah, you'll go out and ride a big horse and you'll pump some iron. Oh, this is what we're like. But inside you're a mess. You know, it's just honest,
like
us.
As soon as I'd floated the idea of Russian sex riots, I'd have been out of ideas.
But basically, no, I don't believe in conspiracy. I think, yeah, sometimes a lot of people might get together in a room. Like I'm sure Prince Philip sits with the heads of the Trilateral Commission and they play Snap or whatever the hell they do. And they talk about stuff. But right over there's another bunch of people who hate them and who are doing other stuff and they're just as rich and they're just as powerful. They all hate each other and they all hate death and they're all struggling against that. And really, nobody's in charge. That's the terrifying story. But yet our religious impulse drives us towards there must be somebody. It must be either lizards or President Kennedy's still alive and he's running the show, or it's happening from the moon, or please God, please let somebody be in charge. There is no one in charge. That's all it is. You just meet in a room, but then there's a bunch of Chinese guys meeting in a room, there's Russian guys meeting in a room, there's people in Europe meeting in rooms that all hate each other and they're all working against each other, and that's why the world's so wonderful.
Have you followed on this story about PRISM and the NSA and people spying on emails and stuff like that?
No, I follow nothing to do with reality. I've got no... I can tell you right now what's happening in Spider-Man's life or in Superman's life, but ask me, are we being watched? Have they got their hand up me? I don't know.
It seems quite likely that we're being, like, they're pretty much looking through every email. They're looking through, like...
But I love that. You know, imagine the horror of that. It's 13 hours of your day in GCHQ to go through this dull, repetitive, Pinteresque dialogue forever. It's like being sent to hell. It serves them right. But the whole thing is, don't you think politicians are always up to stuff, so they assume the rest of us are up to stuff, so they really want to know what's going on because they want new ideas. And so they're checking all your emails and it must be getting more and more boring every day. Oh, they're just kind of ordinary, they're just talking crap. Meanwhile, the politicians are always looking for stuff to get up to.
And that's why they project onto us.
Yeah, they assume we're all up to stuff and we've all got things to hide. Of course we don't. We're just people.
That's right, but that's the big thing, the benefits thing. Oh, they're all fiddling their benefits because they're fiddling their expenses.
Yeah, so they assume everyone's at it.
They're all at it. Here's something I was planning on asking you. What do you think stories are for? Is there a purpose to them? Is it an evolutionary purpose? Is it a teaching purpose?
Well, you had that thing in your book about basically stories teach us how to behave, you know, and it's like sometimes you get caught up in it to the point where most of us, if you're having a fight with your loved one, you're copying the last thing you saw in EastEnders or the last film you saw. You mean you're having an affair? You know, and it's that. It's like that. It's like we learn all these extreme emotional pantomime responses from TV, and that's been going on for like an entire century probably. Totally. And no one can remember what it used to be like in the days of Sherlock Holmes when people said, "Oh, you mean you're having an affair?"
Well, I remember growing up, and in my first relationships, I'd kind of picked everything up from movies and, you know, TV, Moonlight and all that. I thought if you're in a good relationship, you just argue all the time. You have a kind of funny argument all the time. And you don't realise that happened because it's easy to write dialogue if you're having a funny argument, and then you get in a real relationship and you realise that an argument is actually 5 hours of silence.
Yeah, and then you've destroyed your relationship. It's like Moonlight in episode 2 and the two of them hate each other now because of the hideous back chat that's been going on all the way, you know.
There's a guy called Rupert Sheldrake has a theory. It's a bit like what you just touched on about talking about the rats communicating, where he reckons that there's morphic fields, so that information gets relayed without people necessarily meeting each other. I think he started out looking at chimps that couldn't swim, and the minute they learned a tool skill, chimps on the next island learned the same tool skill. So his theory is that there's morphic fields of information that get passed along, and then there's like Jung's idea of the collective unconscious and all that. Do you think there's a case for that being where people's ideas come from, or do you think there's much validity in any of that?
No, I think he's talking shite, man. No, I think, because I was thinking about this, people always ask you when you write stuff, like people come up to you, where do you get your ideas from? And the honest response is, I look in my head and I find them. That's what I get paid for, you know, they're in my head. Where else are they going to be? But I was thinking about ideas are easy, you know. It's like, I don't know if they exist in an ether or just they're simple to create. You get Hollywood type ideas where they'll just say, oh, it's the Smurfs meets Apocalypse Now, and that's a film. So they have a way of making ideas which is just bolting together two ideas, which is this kind of surrealist thing of what would happen if there was a dissecting table with a sewing machine and a gabardine coat on it. Well, that's surrealism right there. So ideas are easy to construct. I don't think they float about in an ether or an idea space. Some of them appear out of nowhere because their feelings are like two little animals are running and suddenly you've got a story out of that. I don't think there's any big deal about this stuff. It's like martial arts. Anybody can learn it.
You've got an interest in the occult and magic and chaos magic. Do you use that in your writing?
Yeah, I do all the time. I did it before I came in here, actually, and now you're all under my spell. I found when I was 19, my uncle gave me these tarot cards and he said, oh, you should check this stuff out. So I started doing rituals and things would happen. You would see these things. And I was totally like a straight edge little kid. No drink, no drugs, no coffee, no nothing. I was like a pin-eyed little mod. So I was doing these things and suddenly you get this big lion in front of you going, hello, I'm right. You know, it's like Aslan kind of thing. So I thought there's ways of changing your consciousness that don't involve drugs, and magic could do that. You know, you could summon what appeared to be gods, but then I found that you could also summon what appeared to be fictional beings. So I realised all you were actually doing was creating very specific states of consciousness, and I totally got into that. But I did it today. You know, if you're going to come and do a talk or speak to people, you should summon Hermes or Ganesh, the Indian god with the tusk, because they're all about writing and language and they allow you to communicate more fluently. So yeah, I was down on my knees basically begging, please get me through this without everybody killing me, because I'm not a professional comedian.
Can you remember what the lion wanted from you?
I can remember it was like Rosemary's Baby. All I remember is these gleaming golden eyes and the sense of pressure.
It wasn't your uncle in a lion mask?
I'll never be sure. I can never be sure of that. But even if it was, I thank him.
You've written for the Marvel Universe and the DC Universe. You've done some of these big redesigning the universe things for them. What do you think our universe is?
A slight mistake. I'm kind of fascinated with these things. As I say, they've existed for decades and they still exist, but they're made of paper. So I was looking at them and thinking, that's interesting. You're looking at that from a three-dimensional perspective on a two-dimensional story that's been around for longer than your entire existence. So I started to think, what would our world look like if you were reading it? And you'd be able to, like Batman, you can see his thoughts, you know, he's got these little thought bubbles on his head, and he doesn't know they're there, and nobody else can see them in the story, but we can read them. So I'm thinking, no, maybe there's something up there reading our thought bubbles. Maybe there's something up there that we're just a flat page to, even though we're three-dimensional. Maybe they're four-dimensional. So I I think the universe is growing in a five-dimensional liquid continuum, which is ties into basically superstring theory and the notion of the bulk and the idea that universes don't grow out of big bangs. What they are is bubbles, and there's lots of them. Because it feels like that to me, you know, when I'm lying in my bed thinking about it very deeply. It feels like a gigantic bubble in a huge information space that's only one of many, and this universe happens to work. Other ones might have people with dog heads sitting listening to this.
So final thing, you're getting started on Wonder Woman. What's that going to be like?
Like I said, I wanted to do this story about mothers and daughters because I grew up with my own mum and my sister, and they were constantly fighting each other and threatening each other with pots of boiling water and knives and stuff. And I just thought that would really tie in well with Wonder Woman in our world. And the notion of like feminism and doing a comic that's all women, you know, the first 60 pages of this thing about no guys in it at all, and it's women doing things without men, and there's an entire society of Amazon women who've been around for like 3,000 years, and they've built their own aircraft and their own technology with nothing to do with men. So it was just really interesting to think of that stuff, and I had to read the entire history of feminism, which was kind of upsetting until you get to Caitlin Moran, and then you get a laugh.
Pretty serious. I kind of think about that about comedy sometimes. About a lot of my favourite comedians are women. To me, it's like comedians are guys who didn't do that well at school with other people and had to kind of manufacture a sort of personality. So this sort of, it's an impression. It's like a thing of going, I'm sort of like this, and by trial and error they find a thing that works. Whereas women are more of a confession in comedy. You're like, oh, I can't believe she's actually said that. You know, some of the best comics in the world, Maria Bamford's one of them, are women.
I think though the funny guys at school, at least there's something. Most of the people at school aren't anything at all. You know, I used to go to school and they'd put us both in the same cubicle for swimming. And you'd have these moments where you'd touch, and it was just the slightest brush of another boy's buttocks against yours. And you say, I'll never have any connection with him except for this moment.
Do you know what? I think that's a fine note to leave it on.
Always was.
It's been a pleasure talking to you. Thanks very much, Grant Morrison.
Thank you. He's totally the powers of Superman, but he's complete underachiever. You know, he would just hang about Hell Head, and he would solve like minor scale problems in the underground and stuff like that. And he used to shop in local stores, and like my dentist was in it. You know, it was the most pathetic lo-fi superhero in the world. And I'd had these characters like the Blue Phantom, who sounds like a sex pest. So the Triple X Ghost and the Chimpians, who are a bunch of chimpanzee superheroes. So I'd always created comics, so they came first, and then I got into music because I realised I'd been sitting in my bedroom for 10 years with no female contact.
Writing about chimpanzees?
No, I was told my head was filled with like copulating chimpanzees. And I thought maybe off it. And they replaced me with Tom and Jerry. Like that's, you know, like Tom and Jerry's the most violent thing in the universe.
There's a whole thing in, you know, people talk about the ultimate thing in graphic novels or comics is to transcend the genre and just get away from, you know, being a comic book. Whereas your thing, I read your book Super Gods, it seems to be more that your thing is that you're part of the continuity. You're one of the people that writes Superman, one of the people that works on Batman, and there'll be people before you and after you. And
yeah. I mean, obviously I make my own characters. That's a totally different type of storytelling. But say you're writing Superman. Superman's been around since 1938. Generations of people have added to this guy's adventures. When he first appeared, he was a kind of communist, socialist champion of the people. Then a few years later the war starts and the guy's like riding missiles into Japanese warboats, you know? And he's like, you know, sitting there like this huge phallic thing extending from Superman's crotch aimed at the Japanese war machine. In the 50s suddenly he's back home and he's got a super cat and a super dog and super friends and people that visit him from the future, and it's like a 50s soldier home from the war. So he's constantly always represented what people are into at any given time. I found it fascinating going into that world where Superman's been real since 1938. He's been around much longer than me or you or anybody in here. And he'll be around when we're all dead and there's other people in a room just like this listening to people just like us. So there's a kind of weirdness of going into those environments where they have these characters that have persisted for decades and suddenly you get a chance to make Superman speak.
I always thought it was unlucky for Superman that he landed on another dying planet. I think
but it served him right, because ultimately everything about the planet Krypton, it's time to get out. So I started up in a band and we got out, and it took like 3 years for any human beings even to notice us.
And how did people react to Captain Clyde when it was like printed beside the junior football results? Or
well, they seemed, because it was a local newspaper, and their idea, like a big major story in the week, was like Mrs. MacGyver's cat has been startled by a starling. So it was like that was a big deal in the paper. Then inside I had Captain Clyde fighting these like skull-faced horrors and baby-eating demons. There was too many bloody bones and like flaming heads.
Cool. There's sounds pretty good.
Right next to the TV schedules. So there was like old women would read this and like long-term unemployed and get like seriously traumatised. So they eventually kicked me off.
Hello and welcome to Chain Reaction. I'm Frankie Boyle and my guest today is a comic book writer that will be recognised by every geek, nerd and potential high school shooter around the world. He's written Superman, Batman, The Invisibles, reimagining whole comic book universes like some fickle and insane Dunoon-based god. Please welcome Thought Engine and Knight of Chaos, Grant Morrison. So when did comics start? How did you get into comics?
Because when I was a kid I was totally always into comics, and they seemed like a really great vehicle for expression. So I had these like characters like Captain Clyde when I was like 17.
And that was in a local paper?
Yeah, it was a local paper and it ran in 3 papers, and he was an unemployed Glasgow superhero. Right? But the guy, he lived in a flat in Hill Head, right?